Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Friday afternoon program. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis. Today we are welcoming Andrew Kimbrell, one of Praxis Peace Institute's leading thinkers and activists. He has been part of our community since 2009, when he was both a presenter and led a workshop at the Praxis conference, The Economics of Peace. Andy Kimbrell is a public interest attorney, author, and advocate for sustainable agriculture. He is the founder and director emeritus of the Center for Food Safety in Washington, D.C., and is currently the executive director of the International Center for Technology Assessment. In 1994, he was named one of the 100 leading visionaries in the world by Utne Reader. And in 2008, The Guardian named Kimbrell one of 50 people in the world most likely to help save the Earth. So in addition to being an attorney, Kimbrell also holds a graduate degree in psychology and is the author of The Masculine Mystique. He is also an accomplished pianist who nearly became a concert pianist in his youth. And I think he begins most days playing Bach. So today I'm going to not conduct an interview as I usually do, because Andrew has a presentation and he will be interested in getting input and our feedback after he presents us with some incredible ideas. So welcome, Andy. It's just great to have you with us again.
Oh, it's so great to be with you, Georgia, and thank you all for sacrificing part of your afternoon to listen to my musings this afternoon. Hopefully, it'll be of some interest. It's funny that you should have mentioned that you have an upcoming program on grades, Georgia, because I have a small psychotherapeutic practice along with the other work that I do. And recently, I had two clients who had that classic dream, which they were sitting in a classroom, and a test was being given out, and they couldn't answer a single, they didn't even understand the questions very much. There was no actual teacher. There was just this existential thing. I'm just sitting here. I can't answer any of these questions. I'm going to hand it in. I'm going to get a zero. I'll fail this class, maybe have to repeat it. And one was in her 50s, the other one was in her middle 30s. And these are the classic examples of sort of post-traumatic stress disorder that
Right.
we all have from this thing that was forced on us as children, this sort of John Dewey Prussian education to make sure that all of our immigrants got civilized when they came to our shores. So it really is an archaic system, and I'm so glad that you're going to be looking into that. I don't like fear-based lives, and the last thing you want when you're young is to already have a fear-based life when you're in grade school. So thought that was very synchronistic. Yeah. So today I'm going to try and take us on a journey. We'll see how successful. I hope it's not going to be overly bumpy because it covers lots of centuries and, theology, philosophy, all sorts of stuff. Uh, but I thought sort of this came to me because my very first job as an environmental lawyer was with the Natural Resources Defense Council. We're going back to the middle 80s. And my job with a guy named James Thornton was to go to places in Connecticut, actually, where corporations were forced to file their reports on the various chemicals they were releasing into the waterways of Connecticut. And they were almost never checked. So the corporations actually were honest, and quite often they were way above the allowed clean water limits. So we would find that out. We would then, take it to the state and then federal EPA. They would be sued, or sometimes just give money, and that money would go to other groups. So that was really a really fascinating time from my very beginning as a environmental lawyer. And the same thing happened with Friends of the Earth. My great friend Brent Blackwelder. I hope some of you know Brent. If he was one of the just amazing people on Earth. But both times later on, after I became a more successful attorney, they asked me to come in and talk to their staff and some of their lawyers. And I went in, I did my usual thing. I'm talking about, hey, the two things we all need is to stop the bleeding. That is, stop that next pesticide, stop that next factory, stop that next pipeline. But that's not going to be enough. We're going to need to change the consciousness that has those things done anyway. What is the consciousness behind that? So stop the bleeding. Got to do that, or there'll be nothing left. Change the consciousness, because unless we do that, there'll never be enough of us to stop the bleeding. And then they said, well, how do we change the consciousness? And this is for both groups. And I said, the first thing you could do to change the consciousness is change the names of your organizations. Change the name of the Natural Resources Defense Council. and change the name of Friends of the Earth. Well, that was received with a little bit of laughter. People say, "Oh, what does that even mean?" And I gave them the short version of it. And unfortunately for you this evening, I'm going to give you the long version of it. Why do they need to change their names ASAP? Um, and um, and that brings us to the topic. And one of the things you're going to recognize, many of you, that we're going to be sort of revisiting one of the great controversies of the last 50 years in environmental ethics. And that is a 1967 paper by Lynn White uh, about saying, is this in Science magazine? It's fairly short, called The Historical Roots of the Ecological Crisis. And he basically said it all is about the book of Genesis. And by that, he meant the sixth day of creation. So we're going to go into that and see some of that's true. And if it's not true, and what does that meant, and where does that leave us today? All right. So let's start with the all of the creation myths that we know of in the world and all of their vision of the earth. And they all share this idea of the earth being a living entity or a goddess. So we have Pachamama, we have the Panis, Atira, we've got Gaia, we have Geb. So throughout all these creation myths, very varied as they are, the human is never placed above the rest of creation. The human is never seen as separate from the other life communities on Earth. Um, Never that I have found, or that anybody I know has found. So we can see this in the taboos of many of these cultures: sacred animals, sacred places, no agriculture in this area, no mining in this area. We can see it in the way they worshiped as other creatures there as superior to the human. We see that in their totems. We see that in many of their practices. So this is sort of the ground upon which 1,000 years before the Common Era, we get Genesis. Not just Genesis, but Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 30. This is where the controversy begins and where our story begins, because it's unlike anything else seen in creation myths that we know of, right? And just as a reminder, basically, well, I'll just read it to you. Just I know you already know it, but here it is. This is the sixth day. Remember the first 5 days? Yahweh separates the heavens from the earth. Yahweh, and George and I can argue about this, but he creates order out of chaos, because George has a very challenging view of chaos, which she can share after this because I think it's really interesting. And then he actually co-creates with earth, their word for earth, all of the plants and animals of the earth, and he declares it to be good. So for the first 5 days, except the fact it's very patriarchal in the fact that he thinks he can create things just by talking, but nevertheless, it's ecologically, that's kind of odd, isn't it? I mean, creation usually takes birth and all this other stuff, but in the patriarchal tradition, now God says it happened. And he declares it good and even very good. But on the sixth day, this happens. And I'm reading from the King James Version, and you'll see the significance of that a little bit later. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and he said to them, be fruitful, increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. And then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds in the sky and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food and them for you. All right? That's the sixth day of creation. So I think you can probably see kind of problematic. But let's look at that a little bit more carefully, right? How is it problematic? Well, there's about 5 ways that I can tell. The first is that all the rest is created from the earth, all the other creatures, all the plants, everything. But the human is created separately from the earth by God. So that's A. B, the human is the only creation that is imago Dei, that is made in the image of God. The rest he said was good and very good, but the human is the only one made in the image of God, right? And because of that, he then gives the human or mankind, and that's we'll talk about that in a second. He gives mankind dominion. Now, there's a lot of argument about what that word really means. Does it mean stewardship? If, in my view, you could be either, but probably for the way it was interpreted in what I'm going to talk about, it is dominion. It's dominion used in the Bible, meaning dominion over tribes, dominion over other people, right? Then he says, multiply and by and be fruitful, but subdue. And subdue in the Bible is used in a number of instances having to do with rape, having to do with war. Yeah, so that's not great. And then the last thing that is on this is the hierarchical nature of it, that there is definitely a hierarchy: God, human, and the rest of creation. So there you have it, the sixth day of creation. And this is where all the controversy at the very foundation of the Judeo-Christian tradition, right there, right there. And this is what Lynn White said. There you have it. That's the problem. That's why we have this crisis, this idea of human domination, human dominion, and the bestowing on mankind the gift of subduing nature for mankind's needs and wants, right? Well, there's a couple of problems with that that come off right away. One is that, assuming a lot of people were told this, a lot of religious leaders said it, but it had little empirical value, did it? I mean, when you went up to a snake, let's say, 500 before the Christian era, and you said, the snake, do not bite me. I have dominion over you. I will subdue you. Well, see how long that lasted. When you saw the plague of locusts coming to take away all of your livelihood and all your crops, you'd say, no, stop. Yahweh says, I have dominion over you. I will subdue you. Well, see how good that did, right? When you fell overboard and there happened to be a shark, you said, shark, no, no, no. I think you get the idea. You're a wolf. No. So this had zero practical value. So the rest of nature simply had not gotten the memo that you were supposed to be dominated by the human and subdued by the human, right? And then by the time the Christian era came, this creation myth is not mentioned in the four Gospels. It's not mentioned in the epistles. Disappeared. When Augustine wrote about creation, he did talk about imago Dei, but all the subduing and the domination and all the birds and the beasts and everything obeying the human and for the human use doesn't exist. Thomas Aquinas, same deal. Come to the 13th century, we get St. Francis of Assisi. He says, Sister Earth, right? Mother Moon, we are all a family. We are all kin, right? That is not considered heresy at all. As a matter of fact, Pope Innocent says, hey, I like that. Start your own group, right? Start your own priesthood there. Start your own. So he does that. So what happened? How come it became such a problem, right? Lynn White doesn't cover that history at all. He just says Christianity is the most anti-ecological religion in the world. End of story. Short essay he wrote. But wait a minute, what about all that contradiction? What happened? Well, what happened was the Enlightenment, right? And the Reformation, right? Starting in the 15th and then the 16th century, the Reformation happened. And one of the things that the Reformation, it had many critiques of the Catholic Church, but and by the way, the Catholic Mass, starting in the 4th and 5th century, as we understand it, never had any reading of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. Never, no reading. The first time the Catholic Mass had readings of the whole of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible was in the 1950s. And then that was solidified by Vatican II. So that's why you hear it today. But before that, the only readings were from the Gospels and the epistles. And as I just mentioned, they did not include this creation myth at all. But during the Protestant Revolution, that was one of the great critiques of Catholicism. Catholicism had all these weird things like the Trinity, like the Eucharist, through transubstantiation, and particularly the veneration of Mary, They were non-scriptural. So what they said is, we're going to go back to the Hebrew Bible. And that they did. And the excitement in the 16th century and in the early 17th century, when the Hebrew Bible was finally translated into English for the very first time and available to people, that is when we begin to see these Protestant thinkers really come around to saying, wait a minute, whatever happened to day 6? Whatever happened? And the word mankind first appeared at that time. And one of its first uses was in the translation, one of the earlier translations of this very passage I read you. The word mankind came at that moment as who was bestowed this gift? Who was this gift bestowed on in day 6? Mankind. And that is the etymology of that word, actually in the very first translations of the Bible. So who were these Protestants? Who were these people that sort of revived this? And the first one was a guy you may know, Francis Bacon. Right? Francis Bacon, the father of modern science, right? 1561 to 1626, he was the Attorney General of England during the reign of King James. He was also a High Chancellor during that time. And he was a extremely religious Anglican and believed literally in the Bible. You may have read Carol Merchant's wonderful book. I believe it was about 1980, The Death of Nature. She goes after, in many ways, very correctly, Bacon, but she kind of neglects this idea that Bacon actually was a true Protestant in the way that he took the Bible absolutely literally, not as a metaphor, not as symbol, but he took it literally. And so he made it his job. He felt his duty was to fulfill the mandate of dominion and to subdue the earth for human use, right? I'm going to quote him exactly here. Let the human now finally recover the right over nature, which belongs to him by divine right. It is God's will that nature needs man to tame it, conquer it, and subdue it. That's Francis Bacon, the father of American science. All right. And soon after, 5 years after his death, John Locke was born. And John Locke, of course, is the father of political theory, one of the great philosophers in the Western tradition. These were brilliant men, by the way. John Locke was also a complete Protestant religious, believer in all this. And remember, at the time of Bacon, James I was a Protestant Puritan, even though his mother had been Catholic. So this was definitely the Puritanism, Protestantism was in there, and the Old Testament was absolutely critical to all of that. And John Locke, again, you don't read this very often, but John Locke took the Bible literally, not as symbolism, not as meaningful stories, right? No Jordan Peterson here about, what it all means, but except, no, he took it literally, literally. And he again said, our job following Bacon, and remember, he's talking to Newton, who's also, completely believes in the Old Testament, as he had a little bit thought that he could even find a code in the Old Testament, spent a lot of time there. But Locke believed entirely that the job was to finally fulfill that mandate, of dominion and to subdue nature, right? And so he says, John Locke has this sort of interesting paragraph. By the way, what I quoted you for before was from the definitive work, of course, by Francis Bacon, which is, the Organum. So these are not obscure texts. And so here's Locke saying, God, who hath given the world to men in common, hath also given them reason to make use of it to the best advantage of life and convenience. The earth and all that it is therein is given to men for their support and for the comfort of their being. Right? So this is something that we have a hard time thinking about, because we think of the Enlightenment as the Enlightenment. We think of them as breaking away from the strictures and the superstitions of the Catholic Church and the Christianity to begin with, but not at all true. Not at all true of Bacon or Locke. or Newton, and almost all their contemporaries. They actually were the Protestant, they were at the head of the Protestant revival of the Old Testament, and with it, the foundational creation myth of the Old Testament. So if you think of that sixth day of Genesis as a trap, as the Genesis trap, it takes 2,500 years for that trap to close with these unbelievably influential thinkers to this day. Right? So you add to that then, a century later, is Adam Smith. Now, Adam Smith is not religion. By this time, much of this has been divorced from this Protestant revolution, and you have a lot of deists. You have somebody like Thomas Jefferson, whose three favorite thinkers were Bacon, Locke, and Newton, right? But he's a deist at this point. He's not taking any of it literally, right? So it had moved away from that, and Adam Smith also was not in that group of religious, sort of Protestant religious thinkers. But he did further that by thinking of all of nature as potential commodities, right? In his system, there was nothing that wasn't a commodity, and so that meant all of nature was going to be a commodity. By the way, that meant that human labor was going to be a commodity. Everything had to be commodified because that's how it fit into an economy otherwise. So probably the most important thing that happened in 1776 was not on July 4th, the Declaration of Independence, but was the publication of The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, because that commodified all of nature. And my great mentor and friend Thomas Berry used to say, at that moment, we turned nature from a community of subjects to a collection of objects. And that was the great consciousness shift. And I would add to it a community of subjects to a collection of commodities and sellable objects, right? But there's something else that happened there in The Wealth of Nations that most people don't think about, and certainly not part of Lynn White's theory. And that is that it was the first use in English of the term natural resources. Also, the first use in English of the word natural capital. It is hard to imagine how incredibly influential that has been. To see all of nature as natural resources for the human, and see everything we do, including these days environmental protection, within the context of natural resources. And my last count, 26 states today name their department that is supposed to be protecting the environment as their Department of Natural Resources. Canada and Mexico, right? Agencies of Natural Resources. And now you begin to see why maybe I had a problem with the name, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and why they fell into the wrong paradigm. Their name puts them in the wrong paradigm. It puts them into the natural resources paradigm, seeing this Procrustean view of the entire earth as nothing but natural resources for the purposes of human welfare, human comfort, and human profit, and the creation of human wealth, as in the wealth of nations, right? So that is a little poison pill inside the Wealth of Nations, that first use. And it becomes more and more popular throughout the 19th century as the technology develops that allows more and more of nature to be used to produce products. And then something really bizarre happens. At least this is in my way of thinking, which is by now this entire movement has broken away from Christianity, broken away from almost any religion altogether. But, Eric Fromm and a lot of psychologists have said just because you stop believing in one religion doesn't mean you've stopped being religious. Just because you have stopped believing in God doesn't mean you haven't projected something else into the God image. Could be money, could be the country, your country. But here's what I think happened. I think at that time, a new vision of progress emerged in the 19th century. We can see this through the etymology of the word progress. It used to mean pilgrim's progress, spiritual progress. The time of the American Revolution, progress meant progress away from the European monarchies into democracy. But now progress became to mean something totally different. Progress came to mean the greater and greater use of science and technology in the market for human comfort, human welfare, and for the human project. All right? So progress became kind of its own religion, kind of a heaven on earth, kind of immanentizing the eschaton, as Eric Vogelin, the philosopher, said, taking heaven and bringing it down to earth. And I think what we have seen is the hypotization of science with a capital S, science being its own sort of God, science no longer just a method, but science having omniscience, that science would let us actually know everything sooner or later, not right away, but eventually science will let us know everything. And then technology was sort of the son of science, sort of the father-son relationship we had in Christianity. And it was going to bring these miracles of knowledge to the earth, to each of us. It was going to redeem us from disease, redeem us from all the limitations of nature. We're going to be able to fly. We're going to be able to speak across nations. Of course, also brought us weapons. But technology was going to let us do everything. But where's the Holy Spirit that comes visit us every day? Where's the Holy Spirit in that ersatz Trinity? Well, that's the market. People are very excited. Let's just buy everything. So science was going to let us know everything. Technology was going to let us do just about everything, including maybe through genetic engineering and make us immortal. And the market was going to give us the excitement, the thrill of the mall, the new car smell, for the fact that many of our lives are no longer great on being, as far as our lives being given away as labor, but we're going to have all these things, the excitement of having, right? So I think an ersatz kind of trinity evolved, each with its own priesthood, the scientists, the engineers, the economists, each with its own abstruse theology, the language of science, the efficiency language of technology, and the abstruse language of market economics, with its Vatican, probably University of Chicago. So we have this sort of ersatz religion that by the time I'm born is there everywhere. And so my great mentor, Jeremy Rifkin, wrote a book called The Declaration of a Heretic, where he said, if you're a heretic to any of these three, if you don't think science is going to let us know everything, if you don't think technology is there to does do everything, and if you don't believe in the market, you're a heretic. And that can cost you your job, can cost you all sorts of advancement in life. And if you don't believe in progress, now we've really got a problem, right? Progress is our middle name. Progress through chemistry, right? So this then codifies the idea that the dominion of man over nature, that our subjugation of nature has been a phenomenal success. Look at it. Airplanes. Look at all of the advantages, all the medical advantages, all the engineering advantages. I mean, look today, even with cell phones, communication, transportation, energy, anything you look at, it would have been miraculous in any other time. Miraculous. So it looks like it was a success. All right. We don't like it. Very Procrustean view of all of nature, but can't argue with progress. But unfortunately, we have now seen that Procrustean view of all of nature's natural resources and not understanding the webs of life that are not directly associated with human benefit and decimating those webs of life, destroying all of those webs of life that we also depend on, has been catastrophic. We know that through the Great Six Extinction. I don't need to tell anybody on this call about what's happening with climate, extinction, soil, water, that we have worked our way into a catastrophic situation. There's no other word for it. We don't have an environmental issue. We have ecological catastrophe. With all of the amazing advances that were made through this wrong paradigm, through this dominion subjugation paradigm, through all of its permutations, and through the natural resources and now the ecological services paradigm, we've come to an absolutely catastrophic moment in the relationship of the human to the rest of the earth community. So what do we do? Here we are. We can try and reform this system. We can try and make things better. You know, we can try and preserve natural resources and try and stay in that paradigm. But I don't see much success there. Look at what's happening in our country and around the world. We now have hyper nationalism. The most recent election shows that hyper nationalism is almost always anti-environmental because it views any kind of environmental regulations as negative for the economy of that particular country. And of course, that hyper nationalism also means that we cannot get together on a global collective level to be able to solve this issue. So I can say, listen, the rise and fall of human dominion, the rise and fall of the natural resources paradigm, the rise and fall of the idea of progress, the rise and fall of the hopes that genetic engineering and nanotechnology and AI are the panacea technologies that will solve all of this. It's all coming crashing down. I know my kids no longer believe in progress. I did when I was a kid. Going to the moon was exciting, but now that's crashing down. So I can't read Thomas Kuhn. I don't know how many of you know to read Thomas Kuhn's work. I find it very dense, and it easily produces a sort of a sleep-like trance in me. But as I understand his elevator pitch, is that you cannot replace one paradigm unless you have another paradigm that fits the new circumstances. I know this through a lot of the work I've done in biotechnology and biology, which is we now know that the entire paradigm around the gene, around DNA being a magic molecule, was, well, Neanderthal science, really, Neanderthal science. We now know that what's involved in heredity, what's involved even in a single cell, in RNA and epigenetics and a zillion other things, the DNA was just one fairly simple piece, not an important piece of the puzzle, but it wasn't the composer, it wasn't the conductor, maybe it was the second violins, right? But we don't have a new way to think about heredity. We don't have a new way to think about biology to replace that. So people are still talking about the genes for intelligence or genes for that, and they use the word very loosely because there's no new paradigm. Well, what about this situation? Where's the next paradigm after this paradigm has collapsed? Where is it? Well, many of you have worked on it. Many of you understand it. But to be honest, I saw it and didn't see it. When it first came out, when James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis came up with the Gaia hypothesis, late 70s, early 80s, I thought it was interesting, but it immediately got taken up by the New Age, and people started talking about Earth having consciousness. This goes back to the ancient idea of anima mundi. I'm not saying the Earth doesn't have consciousness, but it certainly goes back to the older idea of the Earth as a living thing. Your Gaia, that's why it was called Gaia, though he didn't name it that way. William Golding actually did, a friend of his who wrote Lord of the Flies. But it was a kind of a return to that, and I was a little suspicious of it. I didn't see a lot of the empirical evidence for that. And a lot of my great mentors, I'm thinking right now of Thomas Berry, I'm thinking right now of E.F. Schumacher, I think of some of the people that have really been so important in my life. They didn't really quite go with that either. And so I didn't see that as a possible new paradigm until fairly recently. And that's when I began to talk to people who are involved with something called Earth system science. Many of you know something about this, but it's not anywhere near as a fun a name as Gaia hypothesis, Earth system science. I mean, come on, you got to do better than that. But nevertheless, it actually has moved forward in the last 20, 30 years to actually show unquestionably that the Earth is a multidimensional living entity. And just to remind you a little about this, here's Lovelock. The Earth is a self-regulating environment, a single, unified, cooperating, living system, a superorganism that regulates physical conditions to keep the environment hospitable for life. Evolution, therefore, is the result of cooperative, not competitive processes. Here's Lynn Margulis. Evolution is no linear family tree, but a change in the single, multidimensional being that has grown to cover the entire surface of the Earth. All of the elements and life forms of the Earth are part of this ever-evolving, multi-dimensional being. All right? So this is a new form of Earth consciousness, is beginning to see the Earth going back and forward using, the traditional indigenous knowledge, but also going forward and showing the incredible synchronicities, all the very amazing complex feedback loops of this multidimensional entity called the Earth. And that all living things on the Earth are not just from the Earth, not just on the Earth, they are the Earth, along with the non-organic matter. We're working with the non-organic matter. That creates the living being, I prefer entity, multidimensional entity, that is the Earth. And these scientists have made this mainstream. This is no longer a hypothesis. They've made it mainstream through Earth system science. Thought that was, wait a minute, could this be the new paradigm? Right? Could this be a new way of thinking? Because again, we're not of the Earth, we are the Earth. Therefore, you can see my problem with Friends of the Earth. Friends of the Earth simply reinstates the wrong paradigm. We're separate from the Earth, but we're not only dominating, we're not only subjugating, we're also friends. No. I like it, it's friendly, but it's wrong. It's absolutely the wrong paradigm. So that's why I said they should change their name too, along with the Natural Resources Defense Council. So now you know the riddle of how I started this talk, right? But it goes further than that. Mankind, the very word mankind, that now humankind, to get rid of the gender issue, started in those 1511, 1514, and it was first use was to say when Yahweh bestowed dominion and subjugation to what? To mankind. That's when that word came out of Old English and is the word we know today. Humankind. So from its very beginning, the word humankind had this intrinsic, implicit understanding that it was separate. Humankind was separate from the rest of nature, right? We don't say mammal kind. We don't say bacteria kind, right? It's just humankind. Thank you very much. And that's what we're all concerned with, right? All day, 24/7 news, right? So to try and encapsulate this, I've said, what if we were to move from humankind to earthkind? What if we go from humankind to earthkind? Humankind is defined as all humans collectively. Earthkind, therefore, would be defined as all life forms on Earth collectively, that in turn make up what we call the Earth. Now, at this point, earthkind is not a word in any English dictionary. It's never been used. So you can see how this paradigm is relatively new, because you think that would be a fairly obvious word, but it hasn't been. It's a new word in lexicon. It's not a new word yet, hoping to make it a word in the English lexicon. And that's what I've been writing on. But if you want the elevator pitch, 7 seconds, we need to go from humankind to earthkind. And within that is everything else I've been saying. Yeah, but you can't just have a paradigm because I'm talking about it, or just because a couple of scientists are talking about it. Have we seen this paradigm anywhere else? Is somebody else talking about it? And the answer is yes. The answer is that we've seen a lot of people talking about it. And some of the most prominent people that are talking about it are the astronauts. I'm sure many of you are familiar now with Frank White's book, The Orbital Effect. And what has happened is that these astronauts have gone into space and seen the Earth from that perspective and immediately seen it as a living entity and seen all the life in it interacting with all the other non-organic things as a living entity. No more nations, no more wars, no more religious, just seeing it as an entity. Several have even gone to the Vatican to talk to Pope Francis about he needs to take this on. And as Laudate Si, he does. Genesis gets very short shrift on Laudate Si, right? Very short shrift, and that's his big encyclical on nature. Francis, whom he named himself for, gets huge amount of coverage, right? The Dominion, not so much. No more Dominion, no more subject, right? And he specifically says we need to begin to think of the Earth as Mother Earth. So this Catholic Pope coming back to the term Pachamama, Mother Earth, first page, Laudate Si. Oh, that's pretty remarkable. But what about these astronauts? Well, let's think about the astronauts for a second. So here's it's called the orbital effect, and here's one of the astronauts uh, who's written about this. What's his name? He's actually he used to be a fighter pilot. Oh, he's Ron Garan, NASA astronaut, went up there, did a spacewalk, Garan, and he's among many, many others. And here's what he says. I'm going to read it to you. Seeing the planet from the vantage point of space makes it obvious that we're looking at a living, breathing organism, a multi-celled organism, an organism that has different aspects of it based on the various multivariate species of life that exist upon the surface and below the surface of the Earth and in the atmosphere of Earth. And of all those different species, different individual animals and plants are all part of an implicit wholeness that is the planet itself. It's not only interconnected, it's deeply, deeply interdependent. Right? This is not ecologists. This isn't the Sierra Club, not NRDC, not Friends of the Earth. This is a former fighter pilot, NASA astronaut announcing the new paradigm. I don't think he'd ever read anything in Earth system science, just from his own empirical observation. And again, this is repeated numerous times by Sally Ride, name a famous astronaut, they've had the orbital effect. They have seen this, right? So you've got these scientists, you've got the astronauts, the Pope is now a believer. And then I open the New York Times, of all things, a couple of years ago, and I see an article that says, the Earth is as alive as we are. Big editorial. New York Times, which I don't read too much anymore for reasons I don't want to talk about, but there it was, right? And the point here in this extraordinary article, which I recommend to you, was that it was a mistake to think that the Earth needed to be conscious to be a multidimensional living entity. That's a mistake, says this article, and I agree with it, saying if you think about the human or any mammal as a microcosm of the larger being of the Earth, right? Almost all of our systems that make us survive are automatic, autonomous, right? We don't, I'm giving this talk. I'm not aware of all the synapses doing this and my digestion doing this and all the heartbeat doing this and the lungs I mean, all of those systems, and I'm asleep, right? If you're going in for an operation, they put you under. All those systems keep working, regardless of whether you're conscious or not. Even when you are conscious, you're mostly unconscious of them. When you're not conscious, you're completely unconscious of them. And yet that keeps our temperature. That has all those systems in us. And by the way, not just us. There's only about 20 trillion cells that are us. We have 30 trillion cells that are the bacteria and the other beings that are inside of us, that are Earth kind inside of us, making us work. They all work together too without our being conscious of it. So in this way, the Earth is as alive as we are, because that's what's happening with the Earth. We are a microcosm of that in our being with the Earth. So I call this the emergence of Earth consciousness. I think that it fits the narrative that we now see of the catastrophe that the natural resources paradigm, the ecological services paradigm, going all the way back to Genesis, all the way to genetic engineering, nanotechnology, this whole idea of subduing nature, maybe even creating immortality for the human, that's all crashing and literally crashing and burning, sadly. I take no joy in that. But nevertheless, there it is. We see what's happening to the other, we don't grow our food or do anything we do in a mutually enhancing relationship with the other life communities. We don't do it. But how can we do that unless we change consciousness? Well, if we change consciousness to realize that we are not lords of the earth, but we are just another element, another participating element, not dominating, not subjugating, a participating element. This gets us to the great work of Owen Barfield, but I won't go into all of that. Participating element in Earthkind. And as such, the earth itself, not on the earth, not from the earth, of the earth itself. Through that, then we can begin to see some other paradigm shifts fall. once we're in that new paradigm, taking several deep breaths to be, because it's quite a shift. But nevertheless, there you are. So in this paradigm, what happens to nation states? They have nothing to do with any of this. Look what's happening with our nation states. Catastrophe in the 20th century, and now it looks like it's even worse in the 21st, right? That's all part of dominion, subjugation. Now it's just national dominion and subjugation. It's part of that whole pattern, right? So nation states, again, gives way to earth kind, and earth is the primary devotion, and the promotion of biodiversity, our fellow earth kind, as the human project. What happens to old Adam Smith's market economics? Well, they were pretty silly anyway, frankly, when you look at nature, right? I mean, just because we have more demand for tuna fish sandwiches, we shouldn't eat too many because of mercury anyway, by the way. Tuna don't know that. They don't know to reproduce. They haven't read Adam Smith or Von Hayek or Milton Friedman. They don't know about supply and demand, so they don't reproduce more quickly. Oh, the topsoil doesn't either. Oh, the trees don't either. Oh, the aquifers don't either. Nothing in nature, no element has read Adam Smith or knows anything about supply and demand. It is a creature of the wrong paradigm. It has to go. We have to think of economics as a subdivision of ecology. That's all it is. What about our politics? Well, it's completely different politics. There is no politics among Earthkind unless it's also ecology as politics. How do we judge what we do as our policies? By Earthkind, by the promotion of ourselves and biodiversity in a mutually enhancing way. What about our education? Right? Are we just we're still going to say World War I, 1914 to 1919. World War II started in 1938. America came in 1941. The Korean War begins in 1950. Is that how we're going to continue to teach history within the Earthkind paradigm? No, of course not. That's not going to be there at all, right? And what about our technologies? What about our science? What about, right? We know that the market's gone. Well, science becomes the science of ecology. Our science, the purpose of our science is to make us better members of Earthkind, not to make us dominating. Do we get rid of our technologies? No. But we find appropriate technologies that allow us to feed ourselves in a mutually enhancing way with the rest of the world, that allow us to communicate, let us to have whatever energy we can find within this mutually enhancing relationship with our fellow Earthkind, because we are the Earth. So it isn't just this one paradigm. You see all these other paradigms that were creatures of this wrong paradigm. So it isn't just NRDC changing its name, isn't just FOE changing its name. We see these fundamental paradigms, and there's many more than what I'm just talking about, but I don't want to belabor this, but you can imagine many of them yourself that will fall if we can get into the Earthkind, new Earth consciousness, understanding that science, and astronauts, and now even religion is bringing about, they just haven't connected yet, right? Those various forces around this new paradigm have not congealed yet. And so my hope is that the ecological movement can be a huge force, not for reform anymore, not just, and I believe me, I was an environmental attorney, still am an environmental attorney, not that we'd give up on stopping the bleeding, not we can still enforce the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, all those tools, wish we had better ones, not saying we should stop that, but they need, in my view, to come into this new paradigm. They need to say, listen, this is the new paradigm. We cannot keep playing in that old paradigm and expect to see systemic transformational change. We're going to have to come to a new paradigm. It's sitting right in front of us. There's science behind it. There's very charismatic astronauts behind it. There's freaking Pope behind it. Let's make this happen instead of staying with reformist, very narrow, and sometimes even corporate supported programs that they now do. So that is my call. And with the work I'm doing on this article in this book that I'm doing, that's going to be my call. So thank you for your patience. Thank you for listening to all of this and this rather rapid run through all these centuries and ideas. But I hope it made some sense, and I look forward to your comments and your suggestions.
This is fabulous, Andy. I really, really appreciate what you've just done. And I'm going to make a suggestion. I don't know how long the lead time will be before your book will be published, but I would suggest that you do a shorter article on this and submit it to the Scientific American magazine.
Mhm.
or nature or both. And I'll tell you why, because the editors they have now are much more open to this kind of thinking than the ones they used to have. And I think it would be great for scientists and people interested in science to read this, to understand what you're talking about. Secondly, George Lakoff would totally agree with you about the way things are labeled, the names that are used, the paradigms that they refer to, and that if we keep using the language of the old paradigm, we're never going to escape it. We're going to keep recycling ourselves in it. So I think that's important. And another thing you mentioned, which struck me, was that evolution has happened because of cooperation, not competition. And I just finished reading a book for our book club that was published in 1902. So this is over 100 years ago by Peter Kropotkin, who was a Russian philosopher. You probably, I'm sure you are familiar with his work, but he made that same argument that, and not only did he make the argument with lots of, I guess, notes, footnotes, examples, to prove the point that it's cooperation that has caused evolution, not competition. And he points out the mistakes that people made from Darwin's books. So I thought that was really interesting. And now going to the defining and the understanding, when you say about the consciousness, where is the educational component in this to really get the ideas first to the leaders who can actually get the ideas out into the public? How do you see this happening? And then I want to open up to questions.
Yeah, a couple of comments. One is I'm a huge fan of George Lakoff, and I've spent many happy hours in his company, along with my sadly departed friend, Rabbi Michael Lerner, who he and George and Fritjof Capra and the rest of us, we used to have regular Sunday breakfasts, which would report it on Tikkun, where all these ideas were flying around all the time. Some of the happier breakfasts of my life, I can tell you. So you can probably see some of the footprints of his work and my work on metaphor and on paradigm shift. Absolutely, on that. I am working on an article with my great friend Jan Hartke. I don't know if people there know Jan. Jan's a great guy. He's one of the vice president of the Humane Society of the United States. Ran for office. He's his father started the Institute of Peace in Washington D.C. He's one of the great people today who still use the word peace and diplomacy. When was the last time you heard a leader on either party talk about peace and diplomacy, except maybe Trump recently, and God help us with there. Yeah, so I appreciate that. I think education is absolutely key, right? Because unless we start there, I don't know where we start. And I think we're already seeing a lot of progress in education with nature labs and people getting out more and more. Richard Louv and his idea of nature, what was it called? Deprivation disorder. I mean, I think there's been out there, but I think this is when you're in a new paradigm, it's going to take a huge amount of education to do that. The one thing I'll add to that is one of the problems that we have today in the United States and around the world is there's no longer a common narrative. There's no longer a common purpose except maybe to get rich in the United States. Or just to survive for so many people, living on one paycheck. There's no common narrative. There's no common value. There's no common ethic, right? Paradigms are falling apart. And so one of the advantages of this, however nascent, is it's a coherent, cohesive narrative of what happened, where we went wrong, and how we can not create something new, but amplify what was there before with indigenous knowledge, with every other civilization, and seeing this amazing, by the way, extraordinary 5 centuries based on a foundation myth of not so much a premise, but a premise of a paradigm. And now see what it's done, despite all of the miracles it's done, and where we have to go in re-emerging, redefining, and bringing this new paradigm. And we need that narrative. The environmental movement, in my view, we need that. The environmental movement needs a narrative. All of us need a narrative to try and begin to understand where we've been and where we need to go. And I'm sure there's many others, but for me, this is the most compelling. Now, happy to take questions.
Great. Okay, Fran, you want to unmute? Fran?
So when we think about how do we move forward the Earth-kind paradigm, you of course have cited Genesis as the source of our problem, particularly as it became elevated. To what degree do you see religious institutions as being potential places in which we would advance the new paradigm?
Yeah, I mean, remember, one of the great inspirations of my life is Father Thomas Berry, and one of my dearest friends. Um, uh, he baptized my children into the universe,
Likewise for David me.
I'm sure. So he always gave me faith until his last breath, and I was with him 2 weeks before he died in North Carolina, that this could be done. And he never tired in saying, "Hey, we got to put the Bible on the shelf for the next many, many decades." I'm sure you both heard him say that because there's other paradigms have to come to the fore. But he felt that he never gave up being a Catholic, right? He never gave up that, even though I don't know how many Native American tribes gave him the highest honors, but when I read Laudate Si, which I recommend all of you read if you haven't read it, it reads like Father Thomas Berry. I never believed that there would be a pope who would talk about capitalism this way, talk about the mistakes of technology, talk about the works of Augustine and Aquinas in their valorization of even the smallest life forms as the eminence of God. I mean, it's really quite remarkable what he does, and I know that this is intrinsic. Going back into the Eastern Orthodox Church, they actually started in a much more ecological way than even the Catholic tradition. I think obviously it's a problem with some of the evangelical traditions because they are so interested in the eschatology of going to heaven, so interested in that they are perfectly happy to see this earth destroyed, because when it's finally destroyed, then Jesus comes down and there's a revelation, all that crazy thing that sadly many of the people in our government have believed, and which is obviously pathological from my point of view. So yeah, but I think there's a tremendous, I know many, many people in the Catholic tradition, in the Jewish tradition. I mean, again, Michael Lerner comes to mind, and so many people in that tradition. I think there's a minority for sure, but I think there's already a fairly substantial group of people in those traditions who are ready, and many of them are taking on this new paradigm. I don't think it's a shutout way. We can get rid of them. They have nothing to offer, and they have a lot to offer. I think that's really going to be part of this whole new dynamic around this paradigm. And again, I would be completely remiss if I didn't mention how important Father Thomas Berry was for my thinking that you heard today as well. I mean, I feel sometimes I should say, here's a lecture by Father Thomas Berry that I'm giving, instead of this is mine. So yeah, I'm sure he would agree with almost everything I said. I hope he would. I pray that he would. Yeah. But I think, yes, there's room. There's definite room. And frankly, I find it very problematic. And I've worked with every environmental group out there for the last 40 years, that there is such a separation between our environmental groups and religions, that they do not make a real attempt to find those people within the Protestant tradition, the Catholic tradition, the Jewish tradition, the Muslim tradition, by the way, not to mention, of course, the Buddhist and Hindu tradition. All of those traditions have a lot to offer. And by shutting them out as part of this sort of pseudo-scientific enlightenment paradigm, which we've just seen how catastrophe, listen, Genesis would have been just no one got the memo, forget about it, if it hadn't been for the reinvent. This is where Lynn White was wrong. If it hadn't been for the absolute reinvention of it and the reanimating of it by Bacon, by Locke, by Newton, and by so many other scientists of their ilk, they're the ones that brought it into the major paradigm of the West. So that sometimes can also mean all religions are hopeless, don't ever do anything with them, they're all superstition, have nothing to add. And I am totally opposed to that. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, another thing I'm going to bring up, and please do put your hand up if you want to ask a question. Another book I wanted to bring up, and I think I've mentioned it to you before, Andrew, is Marx in the Anthropocene.
Mm-hmm.
familiar with that book. One of the interesting points of it is that Marx, toward the end of his life, and some of his writings and letters that were just most recently translated, show his awareness later on of not only exploitation of workers, but the exploitation of nature on a finite planet. So he did come to that realization 150 years ago. There have been a lot of these voices in the wilderness, so to speak, like Kropotkin, like Marx, like Lakoff, like Thomas Berry. Some way there needs to be, I guess, a container, a way to bring these voices together that educates on a broader scale than we have been able to figure out how to do so far. So that's one of my questions is how do we get this out quickly to a lot of people that can really get them thinking instead of just reacting to the latest news cycle, which is a problem.
To me, that's just an awesomely difficult question to answer.
I asked it.
All I can say is that, you know, as you said, there's so many, I go back to, I mentioned E.F. Schumacher, of course, but I also go back to Jacques Ellul, who in his amazing he was able to tell us. There was a book, I think it came out in 1980 by the former mayor of Paris called Ecology is Politics, right? So that's the first one to really come out and say, you don't have a politics unless it's ecology, right? You don't have that. And so he was already in this paradigm in 1980, and then was Lovelock and Margulis, especially Margulis. Lovelock goes astray, in my view. He's obviously, we owe him a lot, but I think he tends to go astray. Do robots have intelligence? But Lynn Margulis to me was really, if you read her work, she really was on this. So we have these wonderful parents, if you will, of this child and you're right, how we bring this in a social media world. And the answer that I would give is not a very satisfactory one, I'm sorry to say, but a friend of mine, William Kunstler, Bill Kunstler wrote a book called The Long Emergency.
Mm-hmm.
And his view was, that we're at a long emergency, which it's a hard time for us to keep track of, but it is long emergency to a major collapse in systems, which is becoming pretty obvious. And I think that as this becomes more evident, people are going to be looking for a narrative to explain it. And I think you're going to continue to see some people say it's immigrants. Some people are going to say it's environmental regulations. Some people are going to say it's a sign that the revelation has come. There's been all sorts of narratives out there. But what's missing is, and forgive me for using the word OUR, but in my view, our narrative. What's missing is our narrative. So my view is if we go down, pray we don't. But for goodness sakes, I want to go down with our narrative in place, with enough people saying it. This is simple location, Alfred North Whitehead. This is where we are. This is why we are. This is what's happening. And here's the empirical evidence for that. It's there. And here's these amazing people who are there. So how we break through the social media, and here's another thought on that, which is that I'm working on something right now I call Earth Advocates. And that's that with all of the wonderful change.org and move.org and Avaz, we do not have an online community for those who are doing the work around the earth, those who are doing ecological environment. We don't have any. So that means everybody around the earth who's doing environmental ecological work, they're in silos. I don't know what they're doing in Brazil. They don't know what they're doing in Holland. We don't know what's going on in China. So the idea is just like they pulled together this in social justice, war and peace, reproductive rights. I want to do that for Earth Advocates so that we can all talk to each other, so we can share our science, so we can share our legal understanding, so we can share this paradigm, so we can share this. And beneath that, in a very explicit, not implicit way, is that by being Earth Advocates, we offer an answer to the hyper nationalism. We're saying your first loyalty cannot be to your nation. That doesn't make sense anyway. You can't defend the part while losing the whole. There will be no America, Brazil, India on a dead planet. Not going to happen, right? That's insanity. So even if you're a patriot, which I'm not, but even if you were, you'd have to join this because you'd have to keep the planet alive in order to keep your beloved nation alive. But it's an answer saying your first devotion, your first concern cannot be your public concern. We're not talking about your family now. First public concern has to be the earth. So that's again what I'm trying to form this Earth Advocates around, along the pattern of change.org, along the pattern of Oz and move.org. It's just the one that is exclusive to those who are doing the great work, as Father Thomas would call it. So that's one thing I'm trying to do to create an army to get this paradigm through. How successful I will be, I have no idea.
Yeah, that's just before I go to Ben, I just wanted to mention that part of our American consciousness is to think that the international group that does this work will be coming from America, coming from one of our groups. And it's hard for our consciousness to see that we have to think globally and respect all these other areas, not just thinking it's going to come from our country. So I just wanted to throw that in as a side. Ben, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Mr. Kimbrell. When I recall in 2016, when Trump was elected, I thought, well, there goes everybody's ecological deadlines because it's not going to happen. And now, 8 years later, into my shock and horror, we're back there and it's more virulent than ever. So it's apparently all of the deadlines are receding beyond the horizon. So I'm curious about, since you're close to a lot of these ecological, environmental activist groups, what's their take on it? What's their strategy at this point? How are they going to deal with the fact that there will be no progress and probably a lot of retrogression on environmental issues?
Yeah, well, the answer is there will be. But remember that the statutes, which we depend on in our litigation, remain. Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, NEPA, and it would take, 60 senators to overturn them, and they have 53, and you're never going to get Lisa Murkowski. You're never going to. So as horrible as what they can do in the executive branch, and by that I mean the EPA, for example, they are they will not be able to fundamentally change the bedrock of environmental law in this country. They can change, more short term, and they did that in the 4 years that they had in the past. We litigated. I'm a litigator. We litigated. We won a lot of cases against them. I don't like what I think what is almost most worrisome, Ben, is the judges. Is that he will now have another 4 years to put his can I use the word troglodyte judges without seeming too judgmental? In place. And that makes it hard because these guys they're always young. He picks them in their 45, 46 years old. So they'll have another 40, 50 years and a lot of them believe in the revelation. A lot of them are reborn and they believe that the destruction of the earth is the best thing that could happen. And that's one of the reasons they support Israel. They believe that once the original boundaries of Israel are within Israel's grasp, that doesn't mean they like Israel, that they're hoping Israel's going to be great. That means the revelation comes. And if Israelis haven't quickly converted to Christianity, they're not going to go to a good place. But, so I think the Israelis say, yeah, we'll take your support. And we're not kind of buying the other thing, But yeah, so but here's the problem, which is again, and, in a funny way, the emphasis on the climate crisis is a disadvantage because it tends to bring us into reformist politics. It obviously is a terminal symptom. I created the Greenhouse Effect Foundation in 1989. The Supreme Court case that was won, and that was my case. So it's not as if that's my New York Times obituary case, right? That's, because if you're a New Yorker like I am, you've got to be in the New York Times obit, right? You got to have it, right? So this is, I'm not saying it's not important, but I'm saying is that if we just solve that problem, we're okay. Somehow we can solve it through nuclear power, whatever. We can just solve it. We're going to be, no, you're not going to be okay. You're not going to be, you don't have the water. You don't have the soil. We're going to have soil extinction by 2050. What are you going to grow your crops in, right? What about the biodiversity? What's going to happen to your plankton, by the way? That's the basis for all the fundamental basis for all life in the ocean, right? I mean, we're looking at a lot more. It's a symptom, and it's a terrible symptom, like the biodiversity crisis, the extinction crisis. But they're symptoms of this wrong thinking. So yes, we need to stop the bleeding. We'll continue our litigation. I have been to now three of the, I didn't go this year, of the United Nations conferences. To be honest, they're very discouraging.
Mhm.
The last two have been in petrostates, right? Come on. United Arab now Azerbaijan. Come on, you're in petrostates. Why would you have the climate crisis in petrostates? And so I'm not encouraged. But one of the things I do say is I'm not optimistic. I'm not. Optimism means you've looked at the empirical data and you're optimistic that this thing is going to happen. I'm not optimistic. I see too many vectors going in the wrong direction. But I remain hopeful. I did not know the Berlin Wall was going to come down. I don't think anybody did. I've been to university after university. Raise your hand if you predicted the Berlin Wall was going to come down, and I want to see where you did publicly. No one's ever raised their hand. I never thought that Mandela would come out of prison, much less lead South Africa. I never thought in my lifetime we'd see a black president. So things happen. There's the unexpected that can happen. And nature itself may have a plan B. This Earth entity may have its own plan Bs that can help it adjust to what's happening. So I remain hopeful, but not optimistic. And my own views, keep our heads down. For those of us who are good at consciousness raising, write your articles, write your books, get to your communities, get the education going, and we'll stop the bleeding and try and change the consciousness as well. But if I knew the world was going to end tomorrow, I'd probably still plant a tree today.
Great. I'm going to take one last question from you, Fran or David, one of you. Do you want to unmute?
Yeah, that's me this time.
Okay, I thought so.
Yeah.
Hey, Devin.
Hi, Andy. It's really great to reconnect with you and particularly connecting in with the work that we've been knew each other for.
Yeah,
Now,
exactly.
you've done just a brilliant job of framing the new story. And that is so essential to our human future. The thing that I feel we need to add to this, as I think you've heard me say before, is naming the future that we're trying to create. As I think you know, my favored name is ecological civilization. So far as I'm aware, you are basically aligned on all of the framing of that future, but you don't use the name. And I'm wondering if there's a particular reason. Do you have another preferred name for that future, or how do you think about that?
I don't. I've been using the term, or the more modest term, an ecological society. That's based on sort of a Lulz, the technological society, and sort of a lot of works that talk about society. I think I think you've got a lot of gravitas. You've always had that. I don't think I have as much gravitas as you have just as a being, and I've always loved that about you. And obviously your wife too. I'm just going, but David's got that thing, and so ecological civilization sounds sort of grandiose to me, but that doesn't mean it is. I'm more and more. I was just talking to Randy Hayes about this actually. I'm more and more going with the Corton ecological civilization because it begins to have the gravitas of this larger story. So I'm more and more going in that direction. I think that's probably the right direction. So I may be using it more, and I'll of course speak of you when I do. And I think that's probably the right way to go, ecological civilization. And I think that's, again, when we're talking about such large scope, I think society is probably too small a word, don't you think? And I
Yeah.
think civilization begins to give it that scope.
I'm very glad to hear that, Andrew.
Yeah, I think that's right. Thank you, David, for that very much. My publisher, who's a great dear friend, Ralgoff. He said, "No, I don't like your titles, the Genesis Trap or the Rise and Fall of Dominion." He said, "Why don't you just say the rise and fall of the human race?" I said, "Well, I just don't have this.
No, I don't think that's the right one.
I'm not going there, buddy.
No.
I can see it's going to sell more books. I get it. I can't do that in my, I see it, but no, 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 no. So, but I do think it has the gravitas of an ecological civilization. I like the word ecological. Some people don't. I do. I like it a lot. I hate the word environmental. As I go to when I used to lecture in universities a lot, I'd say, please raise your hand if you can tell me something that's not part of the environment. Please raise your hand and tell me if there's something that's not part of the environment. Nobody ever raised their hand.
And as you struggle with this, do be clear that it's not my invention.
No, right.
Okay. Well, you're the first person that really put it forward. So thank you for that. And I think that it's going to be very helpful for all of us, And by the way, the word earth kind has been used before, meaning be kind to the earth.
Mm-hmm.
When I was a board member of the Humane Society, we said we need a humane society, not just for animals, but for everything on earth. And we need to be kind to the earth. So we called it earth kind. We need to be kind to another one. And also remember the word kind has the word kin in it, as in kinship. So earth kind also means earth kinship, which I think is also very lovely. But it shows how far away I was from this paradigm that we were using the word earth kind in this way. And it never occurred to me the evolution from man and humankind to earth kind until relatively recently. It shows how even those of us who flatter ourselves, Georgia, that we're a little cutting edge on this sometimes takes us a long time, and it takes us to get it along in age a little bit to say, oh, now I get it. Now I get it.
That's why we have to live a long time, Andrew. We just can't check out anytime soon. And I wanted to mention, because I think it's relevant to this, the title that we actually agreed upon after many meetings, and David and Fran were in on that, of the next conference that Praxis is going to do is called the Emergent Civilization, Visions, Models, and Roadmaps. So it's the visions, it's the models that already exist that point the way, like the Mondragon cooperatives, and then it's how we get there, the roadmaps of how we actually get there. So that's going to be the focus of the conference. I'm not sure exactly where it's going to happen yet, whether it's going to be Sonoma, Dubrovnik, or Bilbao, Spain, but it's one of those three places. So I know we've kept you a long time, Andrew.
I've kept you a long time.
But it works both ways, doesn't it?
Works both ways.
We've got a lot to say, and this has been really quite profound. I want to listen to it, watch it again. And I will send the link to all of you to the YouTube, our YouTube channel, which will have this on later tonight. So you will all get that link. Any last things I think there's someone who wanted to raise, at this point, I don't want to really keep you longer unless you want to take another question, Andy.
If somebody has a question, I'm
Okay,
here.
we'll do one more. Katie, go ahead.
Oh, I don't know. I appreciate tonight. I just find myself wishing that we could do a panel or a roundtable discussion with people who are obsessing or passionate about this new narrative. And I find myself thinking of I really found Jeremy Lent's book, Web of Meaning, along those lines. And Eisler,
Van Eisler.
had some very good ideas about moving from, patriarchy to the feminine. And I would love to see, and you've mentioned friends of yours, Andy. That's just what I'm wanting to throw out there. And if you have ideas about who would join, let us know.
Yeah, by the way, thank you for mentioning Jeremy Lenz. I would throw in William. He's very controversial, but William Offals actually is pretty brilliant on this. Plato's Revenge. I recommend everyone read it particularly if you're interested in Plato, but also if you're interested in this kind of a paradigm shift. He's not quite on it, but he's almost on it.
What is that book again, Andrew?
Plato's Revenge.
Okay.
So it's kind of wonderful. I think along with that wonderful idea of a roundtable, I am really interested in working with actually, and there's a woman who's doing a lot of work with peace and things, and Heidi Kuhn, who I know, and we're thinking about putting together a group of astronauts, scientists, religious leaders who would come together with a proclamation about this new paradigm. A lot that, it may not be the full detail of what I subjected you folks to this evening, but it would be definitely the new paradigm. And definitely, if I have anything to do with it, definitely embody the idea of earth kind. And I would certainly add to that the ecological civilization. Earth kind is our new identity as we create an ecological civilization. Something like that would be the 7-second pitch, I think, something like that. So that's what we're working on too. But I love, me. I'm sitting with Lakoff and Rabbi Lerner and Fritjof Capra and Ty Cashman and Randy Hayes. I love sitting around because that's how I make progress in my thinking. So it's not just to tell each other what we already know. It's adding those new elements. You go, yeah, that's it. So I find those very exciting and very interesting as an unapologetic intellectual.
That's why I keep liking to do conferences for the same reason, bringing
Yeah.
people together who would normally not even get together.
Exactly.
So that's the whole purpose of it. So any last couple of sentences you want to say, Andy, before we finish?
I would just say that I really would come back to hope, come back to embracing the miracle that we can have this new vision, all of us together, that however unlikely the odds, we can put it forward. What a privilege. I'm very grateful and very grateful for all of you and very grateful that we all have been able now to come to these kinds of paradigms with one another. And then for me, go outdoors. You will all I know find at this very difficult time. I'm the psychotherapist, and he says, do a hell of a lot of self-care. Do just lots of self-care. And for me, that includes the outdoors, includes whatever is your deepest self-care. And for me, that's a big dose of one J.S. Bach, L.V. Beethoven, F. Schubert, and a few others. But I really think, we can get very, very intense, and I know how difficult it is, but to make sure that we take the time to breathe, all of us, do your self-care, feed your souls with whatever feeds your souls. And I'm so grateful that you gave your time this evening to hear me talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy. I want to talk to you very soon after this.
I'm
So
around.
great. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Lots to go from here. So I'm going to stop the recording right now.